systemic solutions to systemic problems. Right? I'm going to steal the thunder from her. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Kenzie on stage to share with us an inspiring talk. So over to you, Kenzie.
Thank you. So hello, GeekCamp Singapore. My name is Kenzie Woodbridge, and my pronouns are they and them. I want to start by gratefully acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the Pacific coast of Canada, where I live, work, and learn on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous peoples. I am excited to be talking to you today about three of my favorite things: people, obscure academic theory, and technical documentation. So here's my plan. First, context and definitions are always useful. Then I will offer up a few, caricatures of the people you might find in any technical organization or project. I'll introduce you to player type theory and talk just a little bit about the history of online games. Then I'll try to connect that theory back to the folks I introduced you to and to documentation, and I'll finish up by identifying some of the challenges and strategies and offering up some possible solutions and strategies that this application of this theory suggests. Also, I hope to make you laugh if I can, because honestly, we all need a bit of that at the moment. So context is important. In addition to my primary career, which, as Terrence said, is as a knowledge manager and technical trainer, among other things, at the British Columbia Institute of Technology, I'm also a communication scholar and researcher, which means I like to talk about context and the way it helps us to create meaning. So I should also say that when I'm talking about documentation, firstly, I just want to let you know that my bias is that documentation is awesome. Docs are awesome. But also, I'm probably using a broader definition than you're used to. For me, and for this talk, the category of documentation includes developers, developer and user documentation, and manuals, knowledge bases, and so on. The things you probably expect, but it also may include things like code comments, embedded help, UI text, even decision logs and meeting minutes. For our purposes today, it's all documentation, okay? So documentation is used by and created by people. So I'm going to start by sketching out a few personas that you will probably know pretty well. Just a word of explanation around naming. When I was writing this talk, I realized that I didn't want to accidentally tie any particular characteristic to any particular ethnic group or gender. So I decided to name my personae for cruciferous vegetables, all of whom, of course, use singular they, them pronouns like I do. So let's start with Sprout. Brussels Sprout, or Sprout for short, is an experienced support desk person. Sprouts love their job because they enjoy helping people solve problems. They have a very good understanding of end users, including what users want to do and how well they can do it. They have significant general technical skill, but they're often person-helping specialists rather than technical specialists. I'm hoping we all know and love, and perhaps even are, in fact, Sprouts here in the room. Then we've got Turnip. Turnip could be any number of different technical specialists, but for this example, let's say that Turnip is a server administrator. Turnip loves knowledge, but Turnip does not like interacting with users. To Turnip, users exist to justify the existence and maintenance of servers, and my friends, those servers are beautiful, even if we are maybe not all equipped to appreciate that beauty. Turnips can be a bit openly dismissive of people who can't understand what a server configuration means just by looking at it. If you're not going to spend the hours that Turnip has put in really learning everything there is to know about it, you don't really deserve to have the information handed to you on a plate. Perhaps this sounds familiar? Yeah. Kale. Kale's very popular these days. Somehow, if there are 15 projects on the go, Kale is always going to be right at the head of the most exciting and buzzwordy project. Kale is here to implement remote software delivery in 6 weeks. Going serverless? Look no further than Kale. Kale is good at quickly acquiring the necessary skills to make something happen, but their understanding may not extend any deeper than it needs to in order to get it done. Kale likes to win at IT. In service of that, they know how and when to schmooze, and they show up at meetings where important people are. If your office is generally quite informal, they're the one that actually irons their clothes on a regular basis. At the end of the project, their name is at the top of the incomplete list of deserving team members when the kudos get handed out in public. If Kale is on a project, that project must come in on time and on budget. Last but not least, broccoli. Being a broccoli, I suggest, is more of a lifestyle than a technical role. Broccoli can actually have any number of roles in your organization, though usually they have at least a little power over others. They could be a developer, project manager, server or database administrator, support desk coordinator, etc. It's often hard to pin down exactly how technically skilled broccoli is, or what their availability is, or what they're actually responsible for. They may or may not be eager to get involved in projects, but if they are, at some point, when it can cause the most stress and anxiety to others, they become a weird, unaccountable bottleneck. Broccoli is great at engineering a situation so that they're causing the problem, but you're the one who will be blamed. I certainly hope that you don't have a broccoli in your workplace, but I'm guessing that most of us have encountered such a person in our career at least once. Now, some of you might be sitting there saying, hold on there, you led us down a garden path with your talk description. This is all vegetables and stereotypes. I'm here to see someone apply an outdated ludic research framework to documentation strategy. Never fear, my friends. We are doing this. So, from talking to a couple of you yesterday, I already suspect many of you already know what a MUD is, and at least a couple have even played one. But for those who haven't, MUD stands for Multi-User Dungeon. MUDs are text-only online multiplayer games. Richard Bartle and Roy Trubshaw created one of the very first MUDs in 1978. MUD popularity likely peaked in the mid to late 90s, which is when I spent my time playing and creating in them, but there are still hundreds online and playable today. The MUD you see me very inexpertly navigating here is actually a version of Bartle and Trubshaw's original MUD called MUD 2. So what is player type theory? Well, in 1996, Richard Bartle, who created the MUDs, published an article in which he described 4 types of players, differentiated by their motivations. He then expanded on his theory in a very weighty tome called Building Virtual Worlds in 2003. The easiest way to explain the types is to sketch out a simple combinatory table. We only need 2 axes. One axis I'll mark as interact at one end and act at the other. I find it helps to think of it as interact with and act upon. The other axis has players at one end and world at the other. Then each of the 4 quadrants is a combination of the 2 traits. So up at the top left, we have the combination of interact and players. These are the folks whom Bartle called socializers. They have fun by interacting, usually pleasantly, with other players in the game. They might play, but they're not playing to win or even to explore. It's the social interaction with other players that interests them. Then over here we have interact and world. These are explorers. They have fun by gaining in-depth knowledge of the game, its mechanics, the environment. Though they might have the hard-won skill to beat the game, that's not really what's interesting to them. Instead, finding hidden things or understanding game mechanics well enough to exploit them for your own uses is. Down here we have act and world. Bartle named these players achievers, and they have fun by acting on the game world and beating the game. They want to get to the highest level, they want to beat all the quests, they get the best armor, and so on. And then in the final quadrant, we have act and people. And Bartle, not one for mincing words, called these players killers. They have fun by acting on other players, often by disrupting their play, perhaps by killing their characters or destroying what they have built or collected. Those 4 are Bartle's player types. And in his player type theory, Bartle posited both a number of interactions and dynamics that occur between players of various types and suggests ways to design a virtual world to encourage or discourage various players in hopes of finding a stable equilibrium of players in the game to make it sustainable over the long term. Now, caveat time. Before I go on, just in case any of you were starting to get itchy at the idea that there are somehow only 4 types of people in the world, I just want to reassure you this is obviously a simplistic model, and our identities and motivations are inherently unstable. Bartle himself suggests that players may have different motivations in different contexts or may progress through all 4 types over time. So don't worry, this isn't about trapping real people in like permanent boxes or anything. It's just a way of looking at the world for a moment. So now it's time for the fun part. We're going to take player type theory, which was developed in the context of game design, and apply it to technical documentation. Applying a theory in this way sometimes lets you find interesting congruences or receive new insights. It's a way of looking at things that you know well from a new angle And if you're a communication scholar, this is also the kind of thing you do for fun, which is to say, invite me to all of your parties. I'm great at parties because I like to talk about this stuff. I don't know, maybe that's good. All right, so when I was reading Bartle's work on player types, I noticed something. Although Bartle was writing about playing a game and the kind of things that motivate individuals to play it, he sure mentioned documentation an awful lot. And that's especially true when he talks about the differences between the top and bottom half of our combinatory on the world side. So interact with explorers versus act on achievers, right? Bartle talks a lot about the difference between a game that you're designing specifically to engage explorers versus one that you're designing to engage achievers. And for the most part, the difference between them relates to documentation of one kind or another. So here's a couple of examples. Emphasizing interacting over acting means designing for explorers. And Bartle says to make the help facilities produce vague information and produce cryptic hints when players appear stuck. Whereas emphasizing acting over interacting means designing for achievers. And Bartle suggests providing a game manual and including automap and autolog facilities. Now, when I read this, it immediately struck me that this might offer a useful insight into a phenomenon that I frequently saw in my workplace. Perhaps you've also seen this. Not all of the time, but at least some of the time. Some of the most specialized and expert people are also the people who write the least documentation or who contribute the least to it. This has always puzzled me. But if those deep dive specialists are motivated in their work by discovery, by figuring things out, then having proper documentation would actually take all the fun and enjoyment out of that for them. Doing a difficult thing is only an engaging task worthy of their skills and their attention if there isn't a walkthrough telling them, each and every step along the way. They can work and even thrive in an environment with poor or no documentation because it's engaging and interesting. This made me start thinking about applying the model to my work environment. So let's go back to our combinatory again. I'm going to modify it just slightly for the workplace application. I'm going to leave interact and act just as they are, but I'm going to swap out players for users. Then I'm going to swap out world for technology. Now, let's bring back the personas I talked about a few minutes ago. You probably already guessed from what I just said that I'm proposing that Turnip is an explorer because they like to interact with the technology. Sprout, who enjoys interacting with users, is a socializer. Kale, then, with their love of winning, is an achiever. And yep, that makes Broccoli, the gatekeeper and weird subtle power player of the group, a killer. So what does this schema mean for technical documentation? Well, we all can and should document at least some of the things we know because it makes our own work and the work of our colleagues and users easier and more efficient. But how can we make that happen? Well, let's get to the meat of this talk. Okay, docs are for everyone, right? Let's take a tour back through those cruciferous characters and talk about how each of the types is likely to approach documentation and what challenges that might create. Then I'll highlight some strategies suggested by player type theory that have worked for me. So Sprout first. I'm going to suggest to you that since Sprout's focus is on users and meeting users' needs, the Sprouts of the world actually often love documentation because it helps them to solve a user's problem quickly and without missteps. They can send a user to a resource that lets them do self-help, or they can step through it with them in person or on the phone, or Zoom call, whatever. Documentation also helps Sprout to maintain their broad technical experience and knowledge, and they tend to give back to it. As a support desk person, worker in a team, Sprout also often wants to support their colleagues in solving user problems. So if, for example, Sprout figures out a workaround that isn't documented, they will tend to document it. In fact, in my experience, Sprout is a natural documenter. And if Sprout is working in a place without a central documentation repository, or if they are prevented from easily contributing to it, they will be the person with 40-word documents on their desktop that they can quickly email to a user in need. Here's the challenge. Despite their expertise and knowledge, Sprouts are often undervalued and sit low in the IT workplace hierarchy. So I want to note that in player type theory, Bartle sees socializers as critical elements in a stable game community. He notes that without sufficient socializers in the community, a game's player base will inevitably dwindle. That's because within a game environment, socializers provide an appreciative and companionable audience for explorers, and achievers and reactive prey for killers, which is an uncomfortable thought. In a tech environment, sprouts can have even more impact, however. In addition to producing their own documentation focused on the actual needs of the users they have contact with, they are appreciative users, testers, and communicators of any documentation that their more tech-specialized colleagues produce. Sprouts are important and even pivotal contributors, so we should take seriously the problem of their marginalization in our organizations and their possible targeting by the killers/broccolis of the world. It's worth pointing out that a work environment isn't the same as a game environment. Workers have less freedom to just physically leave if they're bored or harassed, but they can certainly disengage, stop going the extra mile, and stop doing things like writing and maintaining documentation. So how can you help? If you have any power or influence, I suggest a two-front approach: structural support and cultural support. Under structural support, I should say, all of my suggestions actually apply to every type to a greater or lesser degree. First, I suggest you can never go wrong with a structured template. Nothing aggressively and intimidatingly stares down a potential documenter like a completely blank document, right? I actually have more to say about templates, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Second, provide a place for their docs to live that is integrated with the rest of the documentation. This is very useful. Adopt my broad definition of documentation and keep it all together in an organized way. And finally, I suggest that some non-judgmental assistance with editing and publishing could be useful if the person, has the desire to write it, but not necessarily yet the skill. If you are lucky enough to have a specialist writer like me on the team, then that kind of support is just a natural part of that role. But if not, a buddy system could be a good strategy, or social group documentation sprints with a culture of folks being a second reader for each other. You may also need to try to change the culture of your organization. So use whatever influence you have to advocate for sprouts, and make sure that they are being included where they are being needlessly excluded. If you're in project meetings and there's never anyone there who supports users, ask why not. Ask it often. Get sprouts in the room because they know things that developers and administrators and project managers don't know. Better than being reactive, of course, is anticipating when there could be opportunities for sprouts to be involved and then make that happen. And finally, become the local sprout ambassador. Talk about the good work that they do. Don't let people talk them down in front of you. Thank them for the work that they do publicly in front of others. Basically, what I'm saying is that if you care about documentation, sprouts are your natural allies. And if they're being dismissed, forgotten, excluded, or discounted, your documentation is going to be worse. Your workplace culture will be less engaging and enjoyable, and supporting your user community is going to be a lot harder. Oh, Turnip. As an explorer, Turnip is motivated by knowledge and likes to have the freedom to explore and figure things out for themselves. Learning and exploring are so central to a Turnip's motivations that they have difficulty imagining that this isn't true of everyone else. Something that I've heard a lot from the Turnips I work with, whom I love, is that they don't want to tell users best practices or guidelines for how to use a tool because the tool is flexible and or intuitive, and users should just spend a bit of time exploring it and figuring out how they want to use it. They appear baffled by users who just want to briefly use technology to accomplish a specific task and move on to the next thing on the list. And if that seems confusing to you also, you may just have figured out what your type is. Then too, Turnip's deep technical experience and knowledge and their respect and reverence for same can also introduce tension into the workplace, where differences in skill level are likely to be common. In my experience, Turnips tend to be quick to judge others against their own knowledge and expectations. This means that for Turnips, folks who lack experience and knowledge of technology or who aren't interested in exploring the technology for themselves aren't possibly busy people who may be experts in their own domain and just have a lot of work to get through in a day. They're wildly inferior Turnips, and surely no amount of documentation will help with that. What it comes down to is that Turnips are natural anti-documenters. It doesn't naturally occur to them to write it, and if they document something, it is likely to be reminiscent of the quote I showed you previously, cryptic hints that only another Turnip could possibly figure out. And when that doesn't seem to stop people asking them inconvenient and annoying questions, they may just throw up their hands and give up on the documentation entirely. All right. Now, if your goal is documentation that is correct and detailed, then the folklore contained in a turnip's brain is your holy grail, because they're not naturally inclined to document things and because they're busy doing important work. One hopes your documentation process may need to be altered to accommodate them. This is generally worth doing. To get those docs out of them, first, you need to reframe documentation for them. Changing perspectives, looking at things in a new way or from a new angle, can be powerful in changing behavior. If, as a turnip, docs feel either irrelevant or unnecessary or even like cheat guides for posers, avoidance of them is instinctual, and changing that attitude could be very difficult. But let's remember our purpose. We're not necessarily trying to get turnips to read documentation here. We're trying to get them to help create it. So since knowledge and mastery is the motivation for turnips, framing the act of docs creation as a skill, as a domain that they can attain mastery of, is likely to be more effective than just extolling the virtues or necessity of documentation more generally. Docs can also be a way for turnips to, in effect, show off their expertise to others, proving that they are in fact knowledgeable, and perhaps most effectively, show that good documentation can be used to reduce interruptions in their life from lesser beings. This has a broader cultural piece, however, because it will only be convincing if it's actually true. This means that there either needs to be an organizational expectation that it is appropriate to send users to the docs first before escalating users to Turnip, and or if you need to increase the scope of what your support workers are permitted to do for users with the support of Turnip-written docs. I've seen pushback to both of these strategies, but I've also seen some pretty significant successes as a result of them, and there's usually room for at least incremental improvement there. You'll also want to support Turnip's writing efforts. Reduce the barriers that stand in their way. Turnips who know a lot don't actually know what other people don't know. And if left to their own devices and forced to just quote unquote document something, they may not make the best choices. So if you can, identify and prioritize the doc's need, what's needed, and be direct and explicit when asking for it. For example, we need to tell the developers using our product how to turn on the new feature and resolve any conflicts, and we should include a working code sample, is going to be more effective than, hey, could you document that new feature? Provide templates. And then help with the publishing and curation. The information these folks know is useful and necessary, but it's organized in a different way in their heads than it might need to be for your users. This means that at least some of the time you may also need to edit and rewrite some of their documentation for the users. Finally, we all get to choose the hills we are willing to die on, but I'd suggest that winning the fight on consistent use of the Oxford comma with a turnip is not a good use of your time, especially if it prevents them from getting what they know out in an accessible form. Next, Kale. How does Kale relate to documentation? It really depends on how it fits into what they're trying to achieve, because remember, achieving things is what Kales love best. This means that if documentation is part of the criteria that will be used to evaluate the success of a project, it will be a priority for them. Otherwise, it won't. As a documenter, Kales are often opportunists. Kale will happily reuse or repurpose existing documentation, which can be positive or negative. Kale is into big bang launches because that's where the accolades are, but not so much into the incremental improvement or long-term maintenance and support. And as documenters, Kales are inconsistent, in my experience, though they usually love using it themselves. So how to support Kale? Well, first, you want to literally gamify documentation for them. One way to do that is to post the stats on who's doing the doc writing, at least internally. Who wrote the most or most visited this week, this month, this year, who has the greatest proportion of current reviewed docs, and so on. Kale likes to have their name in lights, so maybe consider making the author of docs visible in some fashion, though I admit this might not be desirable in all circumstances. Of course, the biggest gamification strategy I'd suggest is to not let writing documentation be an optional side quest. Having all needed docs in place before launch needs to be a critical success criteria in your projects. It needs to be a standard element in your release plan or project plan. Have clear expectations based on actual needs and ensure that they're in proportion to what's possible. If folks are failing to meet documentation expectations, they may just need more of the supports I'm talking about here. But if they're not even trying, then it's also possible that those expectations are non-existent or alternatively inappropriately complex and unmanageable. Finally, public kudos are important. Thank them in front of others, especially in front of the folks whose judgments matter to their careers or other projects. Once you have them concerned with documentation, you need to support Kale's achievement. One piece of advice I'd offer is to be available on short notice, because that's how the docs in Big Bang launches work, even if it's sometimes inconvenient. Once again, templates are great. Achievers will use them, and it'll make your short notice rush job easier to get through. But if I can offer a word of caution, again, Kales are fans of Big Bang launches of new and exciting things. So if you're not careful, you can end up with them wanting to create a new place for just their docs with every launch. If there was one place to prioritize using your influence, it's definitely in asserting that their docs go in the existing, established, expected place with all the other docs. Maybe sweeten the deal by agreeing to highlight them in some fashion, or at least temporarily. Also, if you can outsource the maintenance of their docs to others, perhaps Sprouts, maybe, you may save yourself many a headache in the future. And so I just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit more about templates. As I've mentioned here, templates can be useful for almost everyone, and I'm sure most of you are already using templates or encounter templates in various parts of your work, whether documentation or other things as well. But you might want to consider whether you could actually use them more extensively and purposefully. One of the advantages of creating more specific templates is that it makes it easier for others to take advantage of your work and integrate it into project plans. For example, we recently created a new template for a support desk cheat sheet, which is now part of the project plan for launching any new or updated service to our community. The template includes a spot for all of the at-a-glance info that a support desk worker might need about a service offering. Looking for this kind of opportunity to create and use and improve templates in your own work and manage and maintain your blank templates with the rest of your documentation. Oh, hey, Broccoli. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. Back to broccoli. Okay, I'm going to suggest that in addition to their other difficult traits, broccolis are often predictably terrible at documentation, not because of lack of ability, but because information is power. So controlling information is also power. If something is well documented, it makes it possible for others to avoid broccoli's influence. Paradoxically, however, broccoli may occasionally add to the existing documentation. When doing so, lets them show a coworker up in front of others. For example, I promise you, however, that they will never, ever, ever review or update existing documentation, ever. Broccolis are inconsistent documenters and elements of destructive chaos. They are also, not to put too fine a point on it, they are bullies, right? So maybe I was avoiding dealing with broccoli for a moment there with my digression about the templates, but I shouldn't have. And that's actually part of my advice to you. I sincerely hope you're not having to deal with broccolis, but if you are, then deal with them. Avoiding addressing the problem only makes it worse. And if you must work with a suspected broccoli, then player type theory suggests a few strategies you can use. First, you want to protect yourself and the other vulnerable members of the team. Not just because these strategies can help with actually getting documentation done, they potentially can, but because, and I'm not joking at this point, work matters. Your experience of it matters, and you are worth protecting. So only talk to broccolis in public. Don't let them collar you in a quiet hallway or a one-on-one Zoom meeting and make commitments for which there are no witnesses. Document everything. Ironically, if you do have a verbal conversation about a project, follow up with an email in which you reiterate what everyone committed to. Don't go it alone, and don't let anyone else go it alone either. Seek out allies and also check in with your colleagues, especially remote, about how they're doing. In particular, as regards allies, Bartle suggests that explorers are the natural enemy of killers, so get a turnip involved. They know enough to keep broccolis in line and to pierce through their lies. And if a broccoli's behavior is nearing or crossing the line of professionalism and collegiality, talk to your manager or team lead about what you're seeing and support it with data, the documentation you've already taken. Then you need to go forward with your documentation projects or other technical projects. Too often, workplace bullies are permitted to act with impunity because people would rather accept their bad behavior and avoid conflict than acknowledge how damaging it is. But if you are able to confront it, you need to do it safely. So even though everything isn't normal, you should still act in public as though it was. So what I mean by that is treat the commitments they make as though they were real and be surprised in public if they don't fulfill them. Follow up in writing and in public on commitments they have made and expect accountability. Escalate the problem to someone with more power than you if you need to, and since you've been documenting everything, you can do it convincingly. Privately expect delays and power plays, but don't tolerate them or engage with them. And finally, especially if you are a manager or supervisor and you're being told that there's a problem person on your team, please investigate and deal with it. It is incredibly toxic for you to ignore someone's bad behavior. And it's also incredibly common for you to have a different experience of that person as the person with more power than them than the people who have less power than them. So don't ignore it just because the broccoli you know seems different than the one that is being reported to you. Take care of it. I don't want to be completely negative here. So I'll also say this. Not all broccolis are what they appear to be. Some broccolis are broccolis right down to their roots, if you will, but I suspect that at least a few of the apparent broccolis you encounter are redeemable. Let me be clear, I'm not advocating that you ever put up with outright abuse or harassment, but sometimes a person who appears to be a broccoli might actually be a twisted version of their former turnip, kale, or sprout self. They act the way they act because of frustration and cynicism, because of a lack of ability to navigate the system usefully, or because they think it's the only way to get things done. But unlike a true broccoli, they actually care about more than their own power and importance. If you can empower them to use their killer instincts on behalf of the project instead of against their colleagues, you might just do everyone a huge favor. If you're up for the attempt, and you don't need to be, but if you are, then here's some words of advice. First, many of us have discomfort with conflict and with anger, and this can make it hard to be around people who seem angry. So if you can, try to temporarily interpret apparent hostility as a sign of how much they actually care about the thing. This can transform your impression of them and make it easier to listen. Then, even if you think you've heard it all before, even if you think you understand their grievance or objection thoroughly, try to really listen to them. Use active listening skills like reflecting back what you're hearing, checking your understanding with them, and so on. There's a big difference between hearing someone say, "I've heard you," and them experiencing having been heard. Few of us are truly reassured when someone tells us, "I've heard what you have to say." It's a lot more convincing to hear them demonstrate a real understanding of it. Be willing to acknowledge real barriers and problems. If someone is in distress about a problem, it doesn't reassure them to be told that it's fine. So don't sugarcoat it. If it's bad, it's bad. And the most reassuring thing is to know that someone else knows it's bad too. Then work together to identify a path forward and enact it. If they truly are a broccoli, to their very roots, you'll find this out in the process. But if they just went a bit broccoli accidentally, then this is where transformation can happen. So that's my talk. Here's the TLDR, right? Documentation is great and will solve all of our problems. Citation needed. Applying academic theory to your work can offer interesting insights and also be fun. And crucifers are tasty. But more importantly, support and advocate for sprouts. They're great and naturally are on side with documentation. Reframe documentation for turnips, then support their writing of it, making it as painless as you can. It's worth doing. Gamify documentation for kales and, no pressure, successfully advocate for documentation as critical success criteria. And finally, protect yourself and others from broccoli and don't normalize their bad behavior. And thank you so much. So I look forward to answering your questions. And you can contact me anytime. And before you ask, as you can see, if you want those slides, they are available to you. There's a link on the screen, bit.ly/playergeekcamp2021.